When Margaret Stone became Portland's most beloved head librarian, patrons trusted her to safeguard knowledge and history. But when her obsession with rare books and financial desperation consumed her, she began poisoning researchers and murdering collectors to steal priceless manuscripts, turning quiet study halls into deadly archives. The Oregon autumn light filtered through the tall Gothic windows of the Portland Central Library as Margaret Stone carefully arranged rare manuscripts and prepared the special collections reading room for what would become the most dangerous research session of her 31-year career as the Pacific Northwest's most respected head librarian and rare book specialist. At 58 years old, Margaret had established herself as Oregon's premier library science professional, specializing in historical document preservation and manuscript authentication that attracted wealthy collectors, university researchers, and private foundations who valued her expertise in evaluating and protecting culturally significant literary treasures. Margaret's domain within the library system included a climate-controlled rare books vault containing millions of dollars worth of historical documents, first-edition publications, and manuscript collections that had been donated by prominent families throughout Portland's history. Her professional responsibilities extended beyond traditional library services to include consulting work for private collectors, authentication services for auction houses, and curatorial duties for traveling exhibitions that showcased the region's most precious literary and historical artifacts. The interior of Margaret's rare books department reflected her dedication to preserving literary heritage and her understanding of scholars' and collectors' reverence for authentic historical materials, featuring custom-designed display cases, advanced security systems protecting irreplaceable documents, and specialized research facilities where approved visitors could examine manuscripts under controlled conditions. Her office walls displayed her master's degree in library science from Columbia University, certifications from prestigious conservation institutes, and photographs documenting her work with famous authors and historians whose literary estates she had helped preserve for future generations. But beneath Margaret's reputation for scholarly integrity lay a dangerous combination of book theft, forgery operations, and systematic murder that had transformed her library into a criminal enterprise where threatening researchers and suspicious collectors met deadly fates. "Good afternoon, Miss Stone," said Professor Edmund Harrison, her 2 o'clock appointment and a 71-year-old medieval literature scholar whose research into 14th century manuscripts had brought him to Portland specifically to examine several rare texts in Margaret's collection. Professor Harrison possessed encyclopedic knowledge of manuscript authentication techniques and had begun asking detailed questions about the provenance of several documents that Margaret had recently acquired through questionable means. "Good afternoon, Professor Harrison," Margaret replied with the scholarly authority and professional expertise that had made her legendary among Portland's academic community, who viewed her as both guardian of literary treasures and expert guide to the region's most significant historical documents. "I've prepared access to several extraordinary manuscripts for your research today, including some recently discovered texts that I believe will revolutionize scholarly understanding of medieval literary traditions. These documents have never been properly studied by modern academic methods." Professor Harrison had become Margaret's most dangerous visitor, not because of his scholarly demands or his research methodology, but because of his growing suspicions about the authenticity of several manuscripts in her collection and his professional obligation to report suspected forgeries or stolen materials to appropriate authorities who could investigate their true origins. What Professor Harrison didn't know was that Margaret had been systematically murdering researchers and collectors for over 4 years, using her knowledge of rare books, toxic substances, and library security systems to eliminate threats to her lucrative manuscript theft and forgery operation. Margaret's transformation from respected librarian to calculating killer had begun 6 years earlier, when her mother's expensive cancer treatment had drained her savings and forced her into desperate financial circumstances that her librarian's salary could never resolve. Faced with mounting medical bills and her mother's deteriorating condition, Margaret had begun stealing valuable manuscripts from the library's collection and selling them to private collectors through black market networks that operated in the rare book trade. Her criminal activities had escalated when a visiting researcher had discovered evidence of systematic theft and had threatened to expose her criminal activities to library administrators and law enforcement agencies. Margaret had murdered the researcher using aconitine poison, administered through tea served during a private consultation, staging the death as a heart attack brought on by the excitement of discovering historically significant documents. The success of her first murder had convinced Margaret that eliminating suspicious researchers and threatening collectors was both necessary for protecting her theft operation and relatively easy to accomplish given her expertise in toxicology research and her access to library facilities where deaths could be attributed to natural causes or accidents. Over the following 4 years, Margaret had murdered 14 individuals using various botanical poisons that took advantage of her chemistry knowledge and her victims' trust in her scholarly hospitality and professional expertise. Her victims had included Dr. Robert Chen, a manuscript authenticator who had discovered evidence of systematic document theft and forgery operations; Jennifer Martinez, a wealthy collector who had begun investigating the provenance of manuscripts she had purchased from Margaret; and David Foster, an insurance investigator who had been tracking stolen rare books through various sales networks and had identified connections to Margaret's library activities. Each murder had been carefully planned to appear as a natural death or accident that occurred during routine scholarly research, with Margaret positioning herself as the concerned librarian who had done everything possible to assist visiting researchers while eliminating potential threats to her criminal book trafficking operation. "Miss Stone, I need to discuss some serious concerns about missing manuscripts and several suspicious deaths that have occurred among researchers using your special collections," said Detective Sarah Walsh of the Portland Police Department's Art Crimes Division as she entered the Rare Books Department carrying a warrant to inspect the collection and interview Margaret about stolen cultural property. Detective Walsh specialized in investigating theft of artistic and cultural artifacts and had developed expertise in tracking stolen books and manuscripts through legitimate and black market sales channels. Detective Walsh's investigation represented an existential threat to Margaret's criminal operation, as her law enforcement expertise and access to stolen property databases could expose the systematic book theft and connect her to multiple suspicious deaths. "Of course, Detective Walsh," Margaret replied, though she felt the familiar surge of anxiety and fury that accompanied any official scrutiny of her library operations by law enforcement officers who possessed the training and resources to detect evidence of systematic theft and murder disguised as natural deaths during scholarly research. "The preservation and security of our rare book collection is always my highest priority, and I'm deeply concerned about any suggestion that valuable materials might have been compromised." Detective Walsh consulted detailed reports from insurance companies, auction houses, and scholarly institutions that had been tracking missing manuscripts and suspicious deaths involving rare book researchers, pointing to specific patterns that suggested systematic criminal activity rather than isolated theft incidents or coincidental researcher deaths. "Margaret, I've been investigating reports of missing rare manuscripts and unusual deaths among scholars who have used your special collections, and I've discovered some very concerning patterns that suggest systematic theft and possibly deliberate harm to researchers," Detective Walsh said, with the investigative precision that had made her successful in solving complex cultural property crimes. 14 valuable manuscripts reported missing from various institutions have been traced to sales networks that appear connected to your library, and several researchers who were investigating document authenticity have died under suspicious circumstances immediately after visiting your rare books department. The detective's identification of the stolen manuscript patterns and her recognition of the timing correlation between authentication research and researcher deaths confirmed Margaret's worst fears that her criminal activities had been analyzed and connected to her systematic elimination of threatening scholars and collectors. Margaret's response was swift and deadly as she realized that eliminating Detective Walsh was essential for protecting her criminal operation and preventing exposure of her systematic book theft and murder spree. "Detective Walsh, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the complexities of rare book authentication and the emotional stress that affects researchers working with historically significant materials, Margaret said, while discreetly reaching for a fountain pen that she had modified to inject concentrated ricin through a spring-loaded mechanism hidden in its barrel. Perhaps we could examine some specific manuscripts in my private vault where I can demonstrate the authentication processes that might explain these concerns about provenance and researcher welfare. The documents in question require careful handling in controlled environmental conditions. Detective Walsh agreed to examine Margaret's authentication procedures, not realizing that the librarian was leading her into a secure vault where previous murders had been committed and where Margaret planned to poison her using the modified fountain pen that would deliver the ricin through a seemingly accidental puncture while handling documents. Margaret's plan involved convincing Detective Walsh to examine specific manuscripts while explaining authentication techniques, then using her modified pen to create a small puncture wound that would deliver the ricin directly into the detective's bloodstream, causing delayed organ failure that would appear to be a natural medical emergency rather than deliberate murder. But Margaret's carefully planned murder of the detective was about to be prevented by the unexpected arrival of FBI agents who had been investigating international rare book trafficking networks and had identified connections to her library operations. Special Agent Michael Torres of the FBI's art crime team had been conducting a comprehensive investigation into international trafficking of stolen rare books and manuscripts that were being smuggled through legitimate cultural institutions and private collections. Agent Torres specialized in investigating cultural property crimes and had developed expertise in tracking stolen literary artifacts through international sales networks and authentication fraud operations. The federal investigation had been initiated by reports from museums, universities, and private foundations who had noticed unusual patterns of manuscript theft and authentication fraud that suggested organized criminal networks were exploiting legitimate scholarly institutions to traffic stolen cultural property. The investigation had focused on Margaret's library after discovering that several stolen manuscripts had been processed through her authentication services. Agent Torres had been conducting surveillance of Margaret's activities and had documented evidence of systematic book theft, forgery operations, and suspicious patterns of researcher deaths that suggested her library position was being used as cover for organized criminal activity involving stolen cultural property. "Margaret Stone, I'm Special Agent Torres with the FBI," he announced as he entered the vault where Margaret was preparing to poison Detective Walsh. "I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of trafficking in stolen cultural property, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of first-degree murder related to your systematic theft of rare manuscripts and elimination of researchers who threaten to expose your criminal activities." Margaret's reaction to the federal agent's intervention was a combination of scholarly indignation and desperate attempts to maintain her professional authority, as she realized that law enforcement agencies at multiple levels had been investigating her cultural property crimes and had connected her library to systematic theft and murder operations. Her carefully maintained reputation as a guardian of literary heritage had failed to protect her from federal investigation into her criminal activities. "Special Agent Torres, you are destroying irreplaceable scholarly research and interfering with legitimate cultural preservation activities," Margaret said frantically while abandoning her plan to poison Detective Walsh and attempting to preserve some semblance of professional dignity despite the overwhelming evidence against her criminal enterprise. "I am a professionally trained librarian with over 3 decades of experience preserving and protecting culturally significant documents for future generations. The authentication and preservation work I conduct is essential for maintaining scholarly access to historical materials that might otherwise be lost forever." Detective Walsh looked absolutely shocked as she realized how close she had come to being murdered by the librarian she'd been investigating for cultural property theft. Her art crimes investigation had not only exposed Margaret's systematic book trafficking and murder operation, but it also prevented her own death at the hands of a killer who'd been using scholarly authority to eliminate threats to her criminal activities. The comprehensive investigation that followed Margaret's arrest revealed the full scope of her criminal enterprise and the sophisticated methods she had developed to exploit library resources for systematic theft and murder. Forensic analysis of Margaret's library operations revealed extensive evidence of her book trafficking activities, including hidden storage areas containing stolen manuscripts worth over $20 million, sophisticated forgery equipment for creating fake provenance documentation, and detailed records showing systematic coordination between manuscript theft and researcher elimination. Her personal belongings included rare book appraisal guides, toxic substance research materials, and detailed profiles of researchers and collectors who'd been targeted for theft and murder. The investigation also uncovered Margaret's extensive connections to international rare book trafficking networks, including criminal organizations that specialized in stealing cultural property from museums, universities, and private collections worldwide. Her library position had provided perfect cover for laundering stolen manuscripts through legitimate authentication processes while eliminating researchers who posed threats to the trafficking operations. Most disturbing was the discovery of Margaret's detailed research into library security vulnerabilities and her development of increasingly sophisticated methods for stealing valuable materials while eliminating potential witnesses through toxic substances that would be undetectable in routine autopsy examinations. Margaret Stone was ultimately convicted of 14 counts of first-degree murder, trafficking in stolen cultural property, conspiracy to commit organized criminal enterprise activities, and numerous other charges related to her systematic exploitation of library resources and scholarly trust for criminal purposes. The conviction sent unprecedented shockwaves throughout the Pacific Northwest's library and academic communities, prompting immediate reforms in rare book security, researcher protection protocols, and cultural property oversight. The case became a landmark example of how trusted cultural professionals could systematically exploit their institutional authority and access to valuable materials to commit large-scale theft and murder while hiding behind the facade of scholarly preservation. Several other libraries and cultural institutions were investigated for similar criminal activities, resulting in enhanced security measures for rare book collections and new requirements for authentication documentation that made it more difficult for criminals to traffic stolen cultural property through legitimate scholarly channels. Detective Walsh and Special Agent Torres received recognition for their collaborative investigation and became specialists in cultural property crime investigation, developing new techniques for identifying book trafficking operations and protecting researchers from exploitation by criminal librarians and cultural professionals. Professor Harrison and other surviving researchers required extensive security consultations and psychological counseling to overcome the trauma of learning that their trusted librarian had been systematically stealing manuscripts and murdering scholars who threatened to expose her criminal activities. The library community implemented comprehensive new safety protocols designed to protect researchers from exploitation by unethical cultural professionals. The case prompted comprehensive changes in library security regulation, including mandatory background checks for rare book librarians, enhanced authentication requirements for manuscript collections, real-time monitoring of valuable materials, and new reporting procedures for suspicious research activities or manuscript provenance concerns. Margaret's conviction also led to increased cooperation between cultural institutions and law enforcement agencies investigating art crimes, with new protocols designed to identify librarians and cultural professionals who might be exploiting their positions to traffic stolen property while eliminating potential witnesses to their criminal activities. The library and broader cultural preservation industries implemented revolutionary new safety measures, including enhanced security protocols for valuable collections, comprehensive researcher protection programs, mandatory reporting of suspicious authentication activities, and improved training for recognizing signs of cultural property trafficking and researcher endangerment. 5 years after Margaret's conviction and life imprisonment, Portland's library community continued to implement safeguards designed to protect valuable cultural materials and researchers from librarians who might abuse their positions of trust and cultural authority for criminal purposes. The librarian who had promised to preserve and protect humanity's written heritage, had instead used her scholarly authority and cultural knowledge to commit systematic theft and murder against the very researchers and collectors who had trusted her with their most precious intellectual pursuits. However, her crimes had been thoroughly exposed, and her victims had found justice through the dedication of investigators who refused to accept researcher deaths as mere academic accidents. Margaret Stone's final chapter had ended in her permanent imprisonment, where she would serve multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, proving that even cultural professionals who attempted to exploit their scholarly expertise for criminal gain could be identified, investigated, and brought to justice when dedicated cultural protection experts and law enforcement agencies worked together to protect innocent researchers from predatory institutional authorities. The librarian's final chapter had become her ultimate literary conclusion of justice, serving as a lasting reminder that those entrusted with preserving human knowledge must never abuse that sacred responsibility, and that cultural professionals who would steal humanity's intellectual heritage while murdering those who seek to protect it will ultimately face the full consequences of their betrayal of scholarly trust and cultural stewardship. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.